The old sea captain's tavern was always the first stop for weary sailors, a dimly lit sanctuary from the ceaseless roll of the waves. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was thick with something more than the usual haze of tobacco smoke and spilled ale. A chill had settled over the room, and the patrons, weathered men who had seen more than their fair share of storms, whispered in hushed tones, glancing nervously towards the battered wooden door. At the center of the room, with his back to the flickering fire, sat Captain Elias Thorne. His face was a craggy map of a life spent on the sea, his eyes as cold and distant as the waters he had traversed. Thorne had not been in the tavern for years, but tonight, he was the center of attention. The whispers grew louder, punctuated by occasional glances in his direction. "Captain Thorne, is it true?" one of the men dared to ask. His voice trembled with a mix of curiosity and dread. Thorne's eyes, shadowed by the brim of his weather-beaten hat, locked onto the speaker. For a long moment, he said nothing. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice gravelly and laden with a weight of long-buried secrets. "You want to know about the Kraken, do you?" Thorne's tone was both weary and contemptuous. "You think you're ready for the truth?" The tavern fell silent. Even the fire seemed to dim as if it too was waiting for the revelation. "Aye," the man said, nodding slowly. "We've heard stories, legends of a beast so vast it could drag a ship under with a single sweep of its tentacles. They say it's more than just a story, that it's real." Captain Thorne took a long swig from his tankard, before setting it down with a resounding clunk. His gaze wandered to the wall, where old nautical maps and faded paintings of ships at sea were pinned. "It's real," Thorne said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "and it's hungry." The murmur in the tavern grew louder, a cacophony of disbelief and fear. Captain Thorne's eyes narrowed as he regarded the crowd. "I'll tell you," he said slowly, "but be warned. The tale I'm about to share is not for the faint of heart. It's a story of despair, madness, and death." The crowd leaned in closer, their breath misting in the cool air of the tavern. Thorne began his tale, his voice steady, but laced with the echoes of past horrors. The Ship of the Damned. It was a moonless night when Captain Elias Thorne first encountered the Kraken. He was young then, the ink of youth still fresh in his veins, commanding the merchant ship Serenity. The sea was calm, and the stars were obscured by an uncharacteristic fog that had rolled in from the horizon. It was this fog that would prove to be the harbinger of doom. The crew of the Serenity was in high spirits, having just completed a profitable voyage. The hold was filled with spices and precious goods, and laughter and song echoed through the ship. But the sea, as always, had other plans. The fog enveloped the Serenity with a suffocating grip, smothering the stars and turning the world into an endless, oppressive gray. The crew grew uneasy, their songs dying away as the silence of the fog pressed in on them. "Captain, we should drop anchor," suggested First Mate Hawkins. His voice was tight with worry, but Thorne waved him off with a casual gesture. "There's nothing to fear. We've weathered worse than this." But Thorne's bravado was a fragile mask over his growing unease. As the hours ticked by, the fog seemed to thicken, pressing down on the ship like a living entity. Strange noises began to echo through the mist. Sudden splashes, eerie groans, and the occasional low, rumbling growl. It was at this point that the crew began to see the first signs of trouble. The water around the ship started to churn, and a great pressure seemed to build beneath them. Men scrambled nervously, their faces pale with fear. "Captain, something's coming up from below," one of the sailors shouted, pointing towards the water. Thorne peered over the railing, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the fog, he could make out the dark shape of something massive moving beneath the surface, something that defied all reason and comprehension. Before he could react, the Serenity was suddenly jolted as if struck by a colossal force. The ship lurched violently, throwing men off their feet and causing cargo to crash about. The crew screamed in terror as the water around them began to froth and boil. A monstrous appendage as thick as a ship's mast and covered in bristling suckers shot out of the water and coiled around the Serenity. The Kraken had arrived. The tentacle squeezed the ship with a strength that defied belief, splintering the wood and tearing through the hull. Water poured into the hold in a relentless torrent, and the Serenity began to list dangerously. "Man the pumps, brace for impact." Thorn roared over the chaos, trying to maintain some semblance of order. But it was too late. The Kraken's tentacles continued their relentless assault, ripping apart the ship with methodical precision. The crew fought bravely, but their efforts were in vain against the sheer power of the beast. One by one, men were thrown into the sea, their screams swallowed by the darkness. Captain Thorn, clinging to a piece of wreckage, watched in horror as the Serenity was devoured by the Kraken. The beast's enormous maw opened, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. The ship, now nothing more than splinters and debris, was slowly pulled under the surface. The last thing Thorn saw before the darkness claimed him was the Kraken's enormous eye, cold, malevolent, and impossibly ancient. It was as if the beast had been waiting, lurking in the depths for centuries, and now it had claimed its prize. When Thorn awoke, he was adrift in the open sea, the remnants of the Serenity scattered around him. He was the sole survivor of that nightmarish encounter, and as he clung to a piece of driftwood, he vowed to never speak of the Kraken again. The beast had left him alive for a reason, and Thorn knew that the creature's hunger was far from sated. He was eventually rescued by a passing vessels, but the experience had left him a broken man. The Kraken's curse had followed him, manifesting in nightmares and a relentless sense of dread that never left him. He returned to port, but the sea was no longer his friend. It was a reminder of the horror that lurked beneath. Years had passed since Captain Elias Thorn had narrowly escaped the clutches of the Kraken. His once proud visage had been marred by time and trauma, his eyes haunted by a darkness that went beyond mere shadows. He had left the sea behind, seeking solace in the landlocked village of Havenport, where the villagers knew him only as a reclusive old man who lived on the outskirts of town. Havenport was a quaint place, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, far removed from the dangers of the open sea. Yet, the whispers of the Kraken's curse seemed to follow Thorn, infecting the quiet village with an undercurrent of unease. One stormy evening, as the wind howled through the trees and rain battered the windows, a group of young sailors from the local port gathered in the village inn. They spoke of adventure and riches, their eyes bright with the dreams of a life on the high seas. The inn's fire crackled, casting a warm glow on the rough-hewn wooden walls, but the young men's excitement seemed to fade in the face of one persistent shadow, Captain Thorn. "Have you ever heard the story of Captain Thorn?" one of the sailors asked, leaning closer to his friends. "The old man who lives at the edge of town. They say he's seen things no man should ever see." Another sailor, slightly older and more skeptical, scoffed. "That's just old sailors' tales, stories to keep us from chasing our own dreams." But the youngest among them, a wide-eyed lad named Tom, was not so easily convinced. "I've heard strange things. They say he's not right in the head, that he's haunted by what he saw." The conversation was interrupted by the innkeeper, who set down a tray of food with a gruff nod. The sailors turned their attention back to their meal, but the seed of curiosity had been planted in Tom's mind. As the night wore on, Tom found himself unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The storm outside seemed to grow more violent, the wind screeching like a banshee. Finally, driven by an urge he couldn't quite explain, Tom decided to visit Captain Thorn. The captain's cottage was a small, dilapidated structure on the edge of the village, surrounded by a thick tangle of trees. The storm had turned the path to Thorn's home into a muddy quagmire, but Tom pressed on, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. When he reached the captain's doorstep, he hesitated for a moment, his knuckles hovering over the worn wood of the door. He took a deep breath and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Captain Thorn. The old man's eyes were dim, but they held a glint of curiosity as he regarded the young sailor. "What do you want?" Thorn's voice was rough, like the grinding of old gears. I wanted to hear your story," Tom stammered, trying to keep his voice steady, "about the Kraken." Thorn's expression darkened, and he hesitated before stepping aside to let Tom in. The interior of the cottage was dimly lit, the walls lined with nautical charts and strange artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the room seemed to press in on Tom from all sides. "Sit," Thorn instructed, motioning to a rickety wooden chair by the fire. Tom took a seat, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Thorn settled into an armchair across from him, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. For a moment, he was silent, his gaze distant. "What do you wish to know?" Thorn asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom swallowed hard. "Everything. What happened out there? What did you see?" Thorn's face grew even darker and he looked away. "It's not a tale for the faint-hearted. It's a curse that you don't want to understand." "But I need to know," Tom pressed. "If there's a chance it could help me." "It won't help you," Thorn cut him off sharply. "It will only bring you closer to the abyss. The Kraken is not something you can escape once you've glimpsed it." Despite Thorn's warnings, Tom was undeterred. "Please, Captain, tell me what you know." With a resigned sigh, Thorn began his story, his voice trembling as he recounted the horrors of that fateful night. The aftermath. In the weeks following the attack, Captain Thorn's life had been a nightmare of broken memories and fractured sanity. He had returned to port as a ghost, a shadow of the man he once was. The sea that had been his home now felt like a prison, and the village of Havenport offered him no solace. The Kraken's curse had twisted his mind, leaving him plagued by visions of the monstrous creature that lurked beneath the waves. Thorn's nights were haunted by dreams of the beast's enormous eye, its cold gaze staring into the depths of his soul. During the day, he would wander the village in a daze, muttering incoherent warnings to anyone who would listen. The villagers, unsure of what to make of him, kept their distance, leaving Thorn to his own tormented existence. But the Kraken's curse was not limited to Thorn alone. The stormy night that had claimed the Serenity had left a mark on Havenport. The village's fishermen reported strange occurrences, disappearances of boats and mysterious deep-sea tremors that defied explanation. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the once quiet village was now a place of fear and suspicion. Tom listened intently, his eyes wide as Thorn spoke of the Kraken's terrible power. "It's not just a creature," Thorn explained. "It's a force of nature, a living nightmare that has no place in this world. And once it's tasted your fear, it will never let you go." As the night wore on, Tom felt a growing sense of dread. He had come seeking answers, but now he was beginning to understand that some questions were better left unasked. Thorn's tale was more than a story. It was a warning, a glimpse into a darkness that should never be disturbed. "Captain," Tom said quietly, "what can I do to protect myself?" Thorn's eyes were haunted, and he looked away. "There's nothing you can do. Once the Kraken has marked you, it will follow you. Your only hope is to stay away from the sea. Never let it claim you, or you'll be lost just like the rest of us." Tom nodded, a chill running down his spine. He stood to leave, but Thorn's voice stopped him. "Be careful, lad," Thorn warned. "The Kraken doesn't forget, and neither should you." As Tom stepped out into the stormy night, he felt a profound sense of unease. The village of Havenport, with its quiet streets and hidden fears, seemed to close in around him. The storm raged on, and the wind howled with a sound that seemed almost alive. The storm raged on, a relentless tempest that seemed to echo Tom's mounting fear. As he made his way back to the village, the rain stung his face and the wind roared in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of the storm's fury. Back in Havenport, the village was a scene of growing unease. The storm had driven the villagers indoors, their homes lit only by flickering candlelight. Rumors of the Kraken's curse had taken root, feeding a collective anxiety that was palpable in the air. Tom's encounter with Captain Thorn had only heightened these fears. Tom sought refuge in his small cottage, hoping to find solace from the storm and the haunting tales he had heard. He lit a fire in the hearth and sat down, trying to steady his racing thoughts. Despite his best efforts, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the house and every gust of wind seemed to whisper promises of doom. Hours passed, and as the storm showed no sign of abating, Tom decided he could no longer ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had taken hold of him. He grabbed a lantern and decided to visit Captain Thorn once more, hoping to find some reassurance or a solution to the nightmare that seemed to be closing in on him. Thorn's cottage was just as Tom had left it, a dark, foreboding place on the edge of the village. He knocked on the door, and after a long moment, Thorn answered, his face etched with fatigue and worry. "Captain Thorne, I need your help," Tom said urgently. "The storm, it feels different, almost like something is coming. What should I do?" Thorne's eyes were distant, and he shook his head slowly. "I've told you what I know. There's nothing left to say. The Kraken's curse is not something you can escape. If it's found you, there's no safe place." Before Tom could respond, the wind howled louder and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Thorne's face went pale and he stepped aside, gesturing for Tom to enter. Inside, the flickering fire cast eerie shadows on the walls. Thorne's hands trembled as he poured them both a drink, but the warmth of the fire did little to dispel the cold, oppressive atmosphere. "I don't know how it's found us," Thorne said, his voice quivering, "but it's here and it's angry." Tom's heart pounded. "What do you mean? How could it be here?" Thorne's gaze was fixed on the darkening sky outside. "The Kraken is no mere beast. It's a force that transcends our understanding. It follows those it has marked, and it will not rest until it has claimed them." As Thorne spoke, the storm outside grew more violent. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain pounded against the windows with a relentless fury. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine as he noticed something in the distance, a dark, shadowy shape moving through the storm, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. The shadow grew closer, and the very air seemed to grow colder. Tom and Thorne stared in horror as the monstrous form of the Kraken emerged from the depths of the storm. Its enormous tentacles reached towards the village, the very sky seeming to crackle with its malevolent energy. "This is it," Thorne said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "The Kraken has come to claim what it is owed." Tom's mind raced, but he knew there was no escape. The village was too close, and the Kraken's fury was too great. The beast's massive tentacles lashed out, tearing through the trees and flattening the houses in its path. The village was consumed by chaos, the screams of the villagers mingling with the roar of the storm. Tom and Thorne watched in horror as the Kraken's tendrils snaked through the village, dragging buildings and people into the depths of the storm. The ground shook with each monstrous movement, and the very sky seemed to be collapsing under the weight of the creature's rage. "There's nothing we can do," Thorne said, his voice breaking. "The Kraken has its prey, and it will not be denied." Tom felt a deep sense of despair as he realized the futility of their situation. The Kraken's curse had claimed not just him, but everyone he cared about. As the beast's tentacles reached the edge of Thorne's cottage, he and Tom were thrown into darkness. In the aftermath of the storm, Havenport was left in ruins. The village, once vibrant and full of life, was now a desolate wasteland. The Kraken's attack had left no trace of the people who had once called it home. The storm had passed, but the damage was irrevocable. Captain Elias Thorne's cottage was found in ruins, but there was no sign of the captain or Tom. The few survivors who stumbled upon the wreckage spoke of the terror they had witnessed, of a beast that had emerged from the storm and consumed everything in its path. The Kraken's curse had claimed its victims, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. The village of Havenport was abandoned, its memory fading into legend. The storm that had swept through seemed to have washed away all evidence of the horror that had transpired. But in the darkest depths of the sea, the Kraken remained, a force of primal terror, ever hungry and eternal. It was a reminder that some forces of nature were beyond human comprehension, and that once touched by their darkness, there was no escape.